Chapter 4 of Mice and Men is a fantastic chapter. It could almost be a short story in itself. We're going to start with the theme of marginalisation, loneliness. Then we're going to think about racism through the character of Crooks, sexism through the character of Curley's wife, ableism through the characters of Candy and Lennie. And then we're going to look at dreams. And we're going to finally finish by looking at power. The mentally able white men have gone into town to seek fun and entertainment, and who's been left behind? The marginalised characters, the black man, the woman, and the physically and mentally disabled men. And this chapter gives the greatest insight into the difficulties of the lives of those characters. In the 1920s, there was a lot of opportunity for women and for people of different races in America. It was the roaring 20s. It was an economic boom time. But when the Depression came after the Wall Street crash, then there was suspicion of women being in jobs. It was sometimes seen as if women were taking men's jobs. And there was also suspicion of people of different races having what could be a white man's job. So a woman or a black person would only likely get jobs which were very low paying and with very little job security. Also, there were hardly any jobs for people who were physically disabled or mentally disabled. All of this led to marginalisation of these groups. Curley's wife, who turns out to be quite wise despite her low position in society, summarises it quite nicely when she comes in chapter 4 and says, "They left all the weak ones here." Weakness is simply not valued in these times. And brilliantly, Steinbeck brings all these characters together in the place where Crooks sleeps, which is the harness room, the place where bits of horse harness are hanging up all around the place. These characters are little different from animals. If the whole novel is about how humans are very similar to animals, then this section puts the marginalised characters even lower and closer to animals. Throughout the chapter, Steinbeck does his brilliant bits of description, and in this chapter it is the sound of chains rattling, halter chains of the horses in the barn next door, rattling, which symbolises the entrapment. As you read the chapter, just notice how many times we hear that sound and the moments at which we hear that sound, usually just after a character has said something about wanting to escape. Suddenly we hear the halter chains rattling, which really symbolises the terrible entrapment of these marginalised characters. Click on like right now, don't wait, click on it now and keep watching the video. One of the saddest things about the marginalisation of these characters is something we've talked about before. They are incredibly lonely. They suffer from their loneliness so much. Crooks, he has to sleep on his own because he's black. And he, again, another wise character, despite his low position in society, points out the crushing debilitation of loneliness when he says, "A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick." He points out that loneliness is a form of madness, really, and he talks about how he sometimes sees things in the night sleeping there alone in the harness room, and there's no one there to tell him if those things are real or not. So loneliness can really become a disease of the mind. Curley's wife also is clearly suffering from loneliness. "I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in their house all of the time?" To get together and to sit and talk helps them against this loneliness. "I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if he don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking, or they're sitting still, not talking. It don't make no difference, no difference. It's just being with another guy. That's all." Steinbeck is showing us through these characters the terrible crushing force of loneliness, particularly on those who are marginalised. Let's talk about racism, which is clearly shown to the reader through the character of Crooks in this chapter, and the chapter starts with him. He gets some form of protagonism here from Steinbeck. He has his place in the narrative at last. there he is, relegated to the harness room, where his possessions are mixed together with bits of harness and horse equipment, showing that he has been relegated to the lowest rung of society, really no better than an animal. But this is nothing to do with his mental capabilities. It doesn't suggest at all that he is in any way subhuman or intellectually abnormal. In fact, it is pointed out to us quite clearly that he has some objects that link him with intellectual activity. So clearly he's interested in his rights, and, as in lots of literature, the spectacles, the glasses, symbolise intelligence, which we will see quite clearly in him as the chapter goes on. So, no, it's nothing to do with his capabilities that puts him in the harness room. It must be simply his race. There is no help, no support for him. And this is symbolised in the fact that he begins and ends the chapter rubbing liniment into his own back. The Jim Crow laws were still going strong in America during the Great Depression. These laws segregated different races in the country, across the country really. The first description of Crooks shows you the pain and the suffering and the suppressed resentment and anger that can occur to someone who has suffered from racism. Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth, seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips, which were lighter than his face. The wrinkles symbolised the perpetual suffering he has had to live with, and the glittering eyes deep in his head suggest that suppressed anger, the glitter, the fire of the anger within him. As soon as Lennie comes into the room, the way that Crooks treats him shows this anger surfacing and shows the expectation that nobody's going to be nice to him at all. You got no right to come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me. Just come to look at my puppy and I seen your light. Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on, get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse and you ain't wanted in my room. Why ain't you wanted? Because I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play because I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, all of you stink to me. He's angry. Lennie's done nothing to him, but you can see from the way he responds to Lennie that he doesn't expect anything positive from any conversation at all. And in fact, he's completely negative about everybody else. So it's a sad and a lonely existence. And then when Candy turns up, Crooks is actually quite happy to have Candy there, but he has to pretend that he's not happy. It says brilliantly, come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. He's now in this position in his life where all he can express is negativity, even when he's feeling positive about something. Later on, when he does receive the treatment that he expects from someone, which is the terrible treatment from Curley's wife, who uses the N-word against him, it says Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. He's obviously expecting that kind of treatment. He knows what to do. He retires into his protective dignity. And the way Steinbeck says of the Negro implies that Crooks here symbolises all black people and the way that they expect to cover themselves with this hard shell when they get mistreated. So he clearly represents the plight of black people in that era. A suppressed anger, no companionship, and just clinging on really to this set of rights which he knows very definitely and which are the only thing he has in his favour. Just as Crooks represents the difficulties for black people in Depression-era America, Curley's wife represents the difficulties for women at that time. In the 30s, many women struggled to find well-paid jobs because men were taking those jobs. In fact, women who had come into the workforce in the 20s were losing some of their better paid jobs and were having to do work. They had to do work because there wasn't that much money and they had to support their families, but they were having to do unstable work or work which didn't get much pay. Curley's wife she doesn't even have a job at all. She wants to be in Hollywood, and we'll talk about her dream of being in Hollywood later on in this video. But in fact, she's got a domestic role, supporting, if supporting is the word we can use, Curley. Steinbeck is showing us a world where you either stay at home and do something domestic, or you do a very poorly paid and risky job, which is prostitution. The dominance of Curley over his wife, the way he is able to leave her there in the house while he goes off to town to have a liaison with a prostitute, shows you the double standards of the time and the poor situation for women. Very interestingly, Curley's wife is quite wise, like Crooks, and she also points this out when she says, "Think I don't know where they all went? Even Curley, I know where they all went." She knows they've gone downtown, even Curley, to have sex with a prostitute. And she doesn't shy away from that fact. Like Crooks, she represents an intelligent person who has been downtrodden by this terrible economic situation and is bitterly aware of this fact. To complete the full set of marginalised characters in this novel, we've got a physically disabled and a mentally disabled man in the form of Candy and Lennie, and they've been left behind too. So Steinbeck shows you that this is not a world for those kind of people either. A migrant worker needed to be physically fit and healthy to be able to get out there in the fields and buck barley. There was nothing like the state support that we have these days for either physical or mental disability. It is true that Candy did get some money for losing his hand, and there was some state support for physical disability. For a mental disability such as Lennie suffers from, people generally used to get put into an asylum where the focus was not really on rehabilitation but simply on containment. So we don't really have any social support structures in those times as we know them today. The comments that Curley's wife makes about these two men really reveal the attitudes of the day. Saturday night, everybody out doing something, everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. A dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. A dum-dum, a lousy old sheep. She uses very negative language to refer to them. She's mocking, bitterly so. And that shows you the attitudes of the day. Candy and Lennie, they do have it a bit better than Crooks and Curley's wife. Yes, because they get to sleep in the bunkhouse with the other men. They have some companionship. But it's not a great time to be alive for either of them either. So what do all of these poor, miserable, marginalised characters do to escape the fact of their misery? Well, they all have their dreams. Now, for the really oppressed characters, which are Crooks and Curley's wife, those dreams aren't really of anything in the future, but they're actually memories of a happier past. Crooks talks about how when he was growing up, there was much more of a sense of community with white people. I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. The white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them, and some of them was pretty nice. Had a strawberry patch, had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on a sunny morning. He had a happier life in the past. His father had some land, but those dreams have gone and now they're just memories for him. Similarly, Curley's wife, her dreams are actually memories of something she could have had in the past, but she didn't get. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell you, I could have went with shows. Not just one, neither. And a guy told me he could put me in pictures. She actually talks more about her dreams of being a movie star, being in Hollywood, in the next chapter, chapter 5. But in this chapter, she is talking about being in shows, being a performer, being in pictures, which means movies. So she has this dream of getting away from there by becoming a famous actress. But just like with Crooks, this seems to be something that could have happened in the past. Then we've got Lennie and Candy, and they've got dreams which are in the future and dreams which they are hoping could possibly come true, even though chapter 3 has made that look unlikely. Lennie is so excited about the prospect of rabbits, which for him symbolise everything about the brilliance of having your own plot of land, that he can't keep it a secret, even though George had asked him to in the previous chapter. And he comes out and tells Crooks, "We're going to have rabbits and a berry patch." And then Candy comes in. He can't keep a lid on it either. And he reveals to Crooks pretty quickly that we're going to have a room to ourselves We're going to have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're going to have green corn and maybe a cow or goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. This is very exciting. We talked in the video about chapter 3's themes about the importance of these dreams and how they offer this hope of freedom. And it seems as if these dreams could come true. And because there's some kind of financial evidence that they might come true, the characters in the last chapter, George and Lennie and Candy, were really getting excited about the dream. And even here, Crooks, despite his skepticism, even he gets excited when he hears that perhaps this could happen financially. If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work like a son of a bitch. Even Crooks wants to get in there on the dream. Ultimately, however, these dreams, as Steinbeck has shown in other chapters, are simply dreams. And there's two ways he makes that very clear in this chapter. First, he has his incredibly intelligent characters, Crooks and Curley's wife, making comments about how dreams don't come true. And then he structures the chapter in a way, just as in chapter 3, to show how dreams can't come true. So wise old Crooks makes one of the most important speeches in the entire novel when he says, "I've seen hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches with their bindles on their back and that same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of them. They come and they quit and go on. And every damn one of them's got a little piece of land in his head. And never a goddamn one of them ever gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. Nobody never gets to heaven and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. They're all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head." He paused and looked toward the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clinked. That is a very important speech. Look at the anaphora, the repetition at the start of a clause. Nobody never gets to heaven and nobody gets no land. He is pointing out that both heaven and the American dream, or religion and dreaming, are simply a form of fantasizing, a form of escapism that can't come true. Look at what happens just after he finishes speaking. The horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clinked. That is the symbol of entrapment. They cannot get away. They dream, but they're chained to these roles and these positions in society. Later on, he repeats pretty much the same thing when he says, "And where's George now? In town in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. Jesus, I've seen it happen too many times. I've seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand." We get this impression that Crooks is a man who has seen it all. He talks about hundreds of men, too many guys. He's really seen all these ranch workers passing through, and there he is observing, and his judgment, which the reader trusts, is that everybody's dreaming and nobody's dreams ever come true. Curley's wife, another wise and oppressed character, makes some very similar comments to Crooks. When Candy explains to her about their dream, Curley's wife laughed at him. "Baloney," she said. "I've seen too many you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why you be in getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass. I know you guys." Very similar comments to Crooks. She implies that men don't have the willpower to really make these dreams come true, and they get distracted by drink and by women, as Crooks says as well. So there's quite a lot of wisdom from these characters about the impossibility of achieving the dream. But the other way, as I said before, that Steinbeck shows you that these dreams are impossible is in the brilliant structuring of his chapter. We talked in chapter 3 about how the dream gets very exciting and then in comes Curley and there's the fight between Curley and Lennie and the dream is shattered by that moment of physical violence. In this chapter, a similar thing happens. Steinbeck shows that this is a repetitive kind of pattern. Even Crooks, with his cynicism, his skepticism, says, "I will come and work for you." And he gets excited about the dream too. But at just that moment, when everyone's excited about the dream, in comes Curley's wife. And she is verbally very aggressive and particularly aggressive to Crooks. She threatens to have him lynched. And so he is trodden down once again. So much so that by the end of the chapter, he's saying, "Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs?" "Yeah," said Candy, "I remember." "Well, just forget it," said Crooks. "I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. He rejects the dream because he feels rejected. It's a psychological way of providing himself with a carapace to protect himself from the hurt he's just received from Curley's wife. That dream is unachievable. He gets pushed down. And so Steinbeck shows in chapter after chapter how people get excited about dreams and then something violent happens and the idea of the dream dissipates. The chapter ends with Crooks rubbing liniment into his back. It began in that way. He has gone precisely nowhere. There was a moment of excitement, but then he's put back in his place violently with verbal violence by Curley's wife, and he rubs the liniment into his back, rubbing his wounds by the end of the chapter. Steinbeck shows there's no potential for progress. The dreams are fantasies. The halter chains of the horses rattle. The circumstances are inescapable. The entrapment is complete. These poor characters, they're lonely. They can't achieve their dreams. They can't even go into town with the other able-bodied men to let off steam. There's only one thing they can do. They can try to gain a tiny bit of power over each other. And so what they do in this chapter is they play these petty power games to give themselves some sense of self-worth. Very often, these power games are simply a form of psychological projection. Now, psychological projection is the idea that you have a feeling about yourself, but you're incapable of really acknowledging to yourself that you feel this way about yourself. So instead, you project that feeling onto someone else and behave in a negative way towards them, as if they were the one who was suffering from what you are actually thinking about yourself. A classic and very simple example of this would be if you feel that you're a person who doesn't take care of their own hygiene very well, and you really have a go at someone who you see like a tramp living on the street. You say, who are filthy, dirty tramps. What does that really reveal about the tramp? Nothing. It reveals something about you, the fact that you hate filth, you hate dirt. And a psychologist might well say that you are afraid that you are in fact quite a filthy, unhygienic and dirty person. That's an example of psychological projection. And we see that going on here in this chapter quite a lot. So first of all, we see it with Crooks. When Lennie comes in, it takes Crooks a very long time to even let him come in and sit down. But when he does, he starts to play this cruel trick on Lennie, doesn't he? He says George might not come back. Suppose George don't come back no more. Suppose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What'll you do then? What? I said suppose George went into town tonight and you never heard of him no more. Crooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. Just suppose that, he repeated. He won't do it, Lennie cried. Crooks' face lighted with pleasure in his torture. The phrase private victory, the phrase his face lighted with pleasure in his torture. This is an example of projection. Crooks has clearly in the past been tormented many times by people saying nasty things to him. And when he gets the opportunity to pick on a victim weaker mentally than himself in the form of Lennie, he is delighted to be able to inflict some torture. It's a way of getting back at all those who have tortured him. And it's a form of projection. I can torture him instead of me being the one tortured. So this is the way that Crooks gains some tiny amount of power, even though it's over Lennie. And the reader thinks, well, that's a ridiculous and a cruel way to gain power. Candy gains some power in this chapter over Curley's wife. Now, this isn't Candy projecting something he hates about himself onto Curley's wife. In fact, Candy's gain of power here is more admirable to the reader because he's actually standing up to Curley's wife when she's been quite cruel. When she uses derogatory terms against them, Candy says, I had enough. You ain't wanted here. We told you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amounts to. He was the master of the situation. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. Yeah, there's something quite admirable about Candy there. pushing Curley's wife away when she's being cruel. But how does she respond to that? Well, she doesn't respond to Candy. She gains power over the other two men. There's this jostling for position. Candy has stood up to her and she turns against the other men. She recreates this hierarchy that we've seen all across the ranch by putting down Crooks and by gaining sexual power over Lennie. First of all, the sexual power over Lennie. Straight after Candy puts her down, she turns to Lennie. She looked longest at Lennie until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Okay, machine, I'll talk to you later. I like machines. There's something quite witty about Curley's wife's flirtations with Lennie there, and he is absolutely mesmerised by her, and she knows it. This is a way of her gaining some power. It will backfire for her in chapter 5, as we will see, but for now, it gives her some kind of power. And then against Crooks, and this is really very cruel what she does here, she uses the N-word and she threatens to get him hung, to get him lynched. So the little power that women did have in those times, and this is recorded in many court cases, is that a woman could accuse a man of raping her, and often a lynch mob justice, not legal justice, would go out and would find that man and would hang him. And this would happen even more frequently if the man being accused of rape was a person of colour, like Crooks. And Curley's wife puts him in his place in no uncertain terms. When he tries to stand up to her, she says, "Listen, you know what I can do to you if you open your trap?" Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. "You know what I could do?" Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you keep your place then. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. That is a brutal moment of verbal violence with the threat of physical violence to gain power over Crooks. And again, we feel this is some kind of projection. She's told us earlier in the chapter that all her husband does in the house is talk about violence. She clearly feels threatened by violence, and so she projects her own fear of violence onto Crooks instead. A terrible moment of psychological projection, a shocking moment for the reader, and another example of these lonely, marginalised characters just doing what they can to gain a little bit of self-esteem by putting others down. So we see a jostling for power in the hierarchy, even amongst the marginalised characters. In some senses, this is because of a need for psychological projection to deal with misery. And in other cases, such as Candy, it's an admirable attempt to stand up for what's right. But to the reader, these petty power struggles fill us with a mixture of pity and disgust. I mean, really? Is it necessary to torment Lennie with the idea that his friend will never come back? Is it necessary to torment Crooks with the idea that he could be lynched? We find these acts incredibly cruel. But I think most readers would end the chapter not feeling hatred towards Crooks or towards Curley's wife, but a kind of sad pathos for them. Really, they are victims rather than perpetrators. They are at the mercy of these powerful forces of the economic depression which have led them to this situation. They are the real mice, not the men. They can't go out to town, they get left behind. They squabble, they bicker, they seek a tiny bit of power, and the reader ultimately feels sorrow for them and sympathises with them. Subscribe to my channel so you can find out when I publish my next video on chapter 5.